Okay, I think we can start. You are welcome. In order to celebrate the 250th anniversary of Hegel's birth, the research group on classical German philosophy at the University of Padua organized a series of lectures on Hegel's philosophy held by international scholars. The pandemic allowed us to host only one of them in person and forced us to postpone the others. Thanks to the extraordinary courtesy and willingness of Dina Emundts, whom I really thank very warmly, we now have the opportunity to restart our series. As everyone knows, Dina Emundts is professor of philosophy at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and she is the president of the International Hegel Society, the Internationale Hegel-Vereinigung, in which she was the successor to Axel Honneth. It is a great honor for us to have her with us today, even if in this strange mode that has become the mark of the strange time we are currently living. The main publications of Dina Emundts are related to the thought of Kant and Hegel. I would like to remember here the introduction to Hegel's thought she wrote together with Rolf Peter Horstmann, published by Reclam in 2002, and two important monographs. The first, Kants Übergangskonzeption in Opus Posthumum, zur Rolle des Nachlasswerkes für die Grundlegung der empirischen Physik, Berlin 2004, 2004. Und Erfahren und Erkennen, Hegels Theorie der Wirklichkeit, Frankfurt 2012. Together with Sally Sedgwick, Dina serves as editor of the International Yearbook of German Idealism. And among the many articles and contributions she authored, I'd like to mention only three here. The Kommentar zum Abschnitt Wirklichkeit in Hegels Logik in a volume edited by Michael Quante, by Meiner for 2018, die systematische Bedeutung der Philosophiegeschichte am Beispiel von Kant und Hegel, in a volume edited always by Michael Quante for Meiner in 2017, and Hegel as a pragmatist, a very important article published in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy in 2015. The title of the lecture that she is proposing today is Hegel's Concept of Time. During the lecture, I would like to ask all of you to turn off your cameras and microphones in order to minimize issues with the connections. After the lecture, we will have about 50 minutes for the discussion. If you want to intervene, please register in the chat room and I give you the word. We would like to remind you that the lecture and question and answer will be recorded. I welcome Dina Emundts once again and thank her for being with us today, and I give her the floor. Please, Dina.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Luca, and thank all of you for being here and for participating in this forum. I really would love to be there in Padua now. But anyway, I'm also lucky to see you that way, and I hope we will have a good time with Hegel and his concept of time. So I will mainly read my text, and it will be about half an hour, not longer. If it's too quick or anything like this, please interrupt me and let me know what I can do better. Okay, so then I will start. although this is not often recognized, Hegel has a sophisticated and interesting theory of time. One thesis in this theory says that the concept of time in physics, according to which time is a pure sequence of now points, is itself grounded in a richer concept of time that corresponds to our experience of time in different human activities. I will refer to this thesis sometimes in my talk. However, I will concentrate on another thesis that I find interesting and challenging, namely the thesis that time has a structure that is shaped by negation. And because I find the thesis so challenging, I would like to discuss this thesis with you. As far as structure is concerned, for Hegel it is crucial that time is not a direct object of reference. Instead, we can only refer to something that is directly present to us in the form of either mathematical or as temporal units. We do not perceive time, but, for example, things that change or pass. Time is what determines these things. That time determines these things can be seen, according to my reading, best in the Phenomenology, in the first chapter of the Phenomenology, because there I think it turns out that time is the universal that determines the particulars. For Hegel, such a structure is suitable to be described as a relationship of contradiction and negation. And that is what I'm interested in today. Negation is understood here as a process and is meant to say something about the structure. Moreover, for Hegel, the point in understanding such a structure is to consider development and dynamics. Taking time as a static concept does not work well. And that is, and I think Hegel thinks this rightly, what a lot of people do, to have a static concept of time. And Hegel wants to give us a dynamic concept of time. By determining something with the principle of time, we also determine what time is. So that is one reason for this development and this dynamic. Hegel even thinks that one needs logic in his sense in order to understand what time is. This is a strong thesis. However, I indeed think that the topic time can make clear what we can gain from Hegel's logic in general. Let me explain this briefly. One difference we make in our everyday understanding is that the stone is somehow different in time than an animal or a human being. One can classify this difference as purely phenomenological or localize it only in the linguistic surface. But for Hegel, it is a real difference. And we can understand it logically, or maybe here we should better say we can understand it metaphysically. Phrases like we defy time, or that there is a law or the power of time, are not only figures of speech, but they are adequate expressions for the way we are in time. In other words, Hegel's logic of time is meant to do justice to our everyday understanding of time and of us as being in time. This seems to me to be a good reason to have a closer look at this suggested logical structure. The first thing we have to say concerns the relation of different concepts of time that we can think of. Time can be seen as a continuum of vanishing now points. This is, according to Hegel, an abstract concept of time. Time can also be seen as a structure of dimensions, namely past, present, and future, that are differentiated. As with Kant, oh no, sorry. This would, according to Hegel, be a much concreter concept of time. These concepts, the abstract and the concreter concept of time, stand in a contradictory relation to one another. According to the abstract concept, time is a sequence of uniform now points. According to the concreter concept, the units of time are different and they do not build a simple sequence. For Hegel, time can actually be both, because the former is an abstraction of the latter, and the latter is a result of the further development of the notion of time through determinations based on this principle. This development is not something solely conceptual. Rather, the real structure of time has these determinations and is only as something developing, namely a development from the abstract to the concrete concept of time. The structure of time is primarily fixed by the concept of negation. This means that what time is not only characterized by negation, but it is even due to negation. Time is the negation of spatial dimensions. Its dimension of the one after the other owes itself to this negation. Furthermore, time is a negation of every single time unit. As a succession, it only exists when a new time unit takes place of the old one and replaces it. In short, time exists due to the fact that units of time pass. Time exists as a negation relationship. Hegel says, quotation, "It is the being which by being is not, and by not being is." That's from the Encyclopedia, paragraph 258. This relationship of negation is also in place when the moments of time are defined as certain moments, e.g., when there is something real. What is real in time is temporal. Through the relationship of negation, one can say that everything temporal is negated. It is subject to time by passing. What is particularly interesting is how Hegel conceives the relationship between time and the temporal more precisely. He asserts identity and non-identity of time and the temporal. Quotation, "The real is arguably different from time, but just as essentially identical with it." This step is decisive. Through the identity claim, negation becomes self-negation, and thus it is asserted that time has a self-referential structure. This assertion of identity further justifies that time is determined by the reality that temporal things pass by, etc. For if time is identical with the temporal, then there is nothing that remains when that, namely the elements of determination, changes. What is the justification for the identity claim? So this was the function of the identity claim. What is the justification for the identity claim? For certain reasons, one must equate both for the identity claim, namely first, that time is identical with the temporal, and second, that the temporal is identical with the time. So concerning the first point, time with the temporal, Hegel would say something like the following: there is time only if there is something temporal. It is in a sense nothing other than the temporal. For the second, namely the temporal is identical with time, Hegel would say something like the following: the temporal in turn is completely determined by time. This determination by time is directly given in the material bodies and the movement in space and time. They are what they are only by their space-time determinations, and fully. In living beings, their determination by time becomes obvious by transience as their essential determination. This also corresponds to some experiences of life in which life is, in the end, and despite all differences, only perceived as passing. But Hegel continues to say, as I mentioned already, that the relationship between time and the temporal is also that of non-identity. So not only of identity, but also of non-identity. What is the basis of this claim? So I would say first, yet again, these two lines, namely time with the temporal, I would say that time differs from the temporal in that it does not pass. In spite of all contradiction, it remains in the negation. So that is where time differs, besides all identity from the temporal. On the other hand, the temporal in turn differs from time precisely in its individuality, through which it can even place itself in contradiction to the uniformity of time. Hegel therefore asserts about the temporal that it, quotation, has time in itself, but at the same time, it is not time. The experience of the domination of time over the temporal corresponds to this, for here time is understood as a foreign power at work, as if death came from outside and did not lie in the temporal. This non-identity claim seems stronger with respect to a living being than with respect to other spatial-temporal material bodies like stones. For Hegel, this actually is right. The temporal becomes more and more independent in its increasing determination in relation to time. This again corresponds to what the concept of time implies. In order for time to be more than just a continuum of now points, there must be differences in the time units. These differences contradict the concept of the uniform continuum, but the concept of time is structured in such a way that both can rightly be asserted, because a development takes place in which a richer concept emerges, while the uniformity is a refraining from differences. So far, I have tried to explain the logical structure of time as a relation of negation of time with respect to the temporal. It is worthwhile to change the question and to ask how thinking or the spiritual fit into this relationship. In our lifetime units, in our lives, time units are sometimes shaped, meaningful, so bedeutungsvoll, and fulfilled, erfüllt, eine erfüllte Zeit. In some processes, the dimensions of time are somehow mediated by each other. Actually, they can be mediated in more or less sophisticated forms. As with Kant, one can say that even in the perception of something, we always reproduce something prior. And in memory, we reflect back, but we also create something new right now. So there, in these activities or these processes, the time dimensions past and present or past and future are mediated with each other. Furthermore, it is important to see that the character of time can be recognized and can become transparent. So in the following, I want to develop these two theses, namely that I just mentioned. Namely, first, I want to say that time or the dimensions of time are mediated. This is the case in different degrees. So in remembering, in working, in enjoying, in forgiveness, all these are processes where mediation plays a role, and these are different cases with different degrees. Time is mediated more or less, or in a more sophisticated or in a simpler way. It is very important for an adequate understanding of time and for the temporal itself that time is something that we have to think of as being mediated one part with the other. The second thesis is the following, that we can recognize this, and therefore we can recognize what time is when we understand and analyze these processes of mediation. And this is what we do in art, religion, and philosophy. So this is the second thesis. So let me spell out these theses. In working and enjoying, time can be fulfilled. But this does not mean at the same time that the structure of time is fully transparent. Something can actually pass away and remain present at the same time. Also, in boredom, it is not only the case that time becomes long, but by its passing slowly, it is experienced as constantly passing in the same way. Thus, time is at least implicitly experienced as constantly passing in the same way, but also at different speeds. Moreover, in activities like repentance and forgiveness, we experience that time is revisable as well as that it is not reversible. In the thinking that corresponds to repentance, we can therefore grasp that a contradiction constitutes time. Time is reversible and it is not reversible. So the German word for reversible would be umkehrbar, so that it can go in one direction, but also it has to go in the other direction, so it can be reversed. However, the principle or opposite concepts of the contradiction are mediated by different forms of negation, and therefore one concept of time is only possible through the other. The underlying idea can be made clear with these examples. For Hegel, there is something like real forgiveness, wherein, at least in one dimension, namely in the spiritual one, it is not just a figure of speech that something really is made undone. So we have something which really happened, but if we forgive somebody, at the same time we accept that it has happened, we also say that it is made undone. So we reverse it. If forgiveness can make something undone, it is only because the something is at the same time recognized as that which really happened. If this is so, it becomes clear that in these spiritual processes, the contradictions of time do not only consist in a simple before and after, something can actually pass by and remain present at the same time. So far, I presented the first thesis, namely I gave examples for the different mediations of the dimensions of time. Now I come to the second thesis, which has to do with the recognition of this structure. These activities, namely perceiving, remembering, working, enjoying, forgiving, and all these or similar activities are considered in art, religion, and philosophy. With regard to forgiveness, it is especially clear that there is a religious interpretation. This is one example, so that we have there a religious interpretation of forgiveness, which has to do with the idea of repentance and then the religious forgiveness. Through the considerations and interpretations in art, religion, and philosophy, the mediation of different time dimensions become explicit and transparent. With the considerations on temporality in art, religion, and philosophy, Hegel combines three further theses, at least. First, it can be understood that time has contradictory determinations. It can be noted that this is a concept of understanding something according to which epistemic activities are closely tied to acting and to experiencing. Second, although the dimensions of time are mediated by many activities and processes, it is something that is considered and understood fully in art, religion, and philosophy. Whereas in art, time is understood by the way we see and feel things, in religion by how we relate to things in feelings, it is only in philosophy that the structure of time is also grasped by understanding it through concepts. Thus, we can really grasp what time is and do not feel or imagine it. Third, if we can understand in this broad sense the structure of time, then we as spiritual beings are also able to enter into a different relationship to time. As living beings, we are at the mercy of time as long as we hold on to the continuity and irreversibility of time. But we can overcome time in spiritual actions, because in thinking and feeling, we are not bound to the space-time order of the continuum, but free with respect to these orders. However, one can only really overcome time by recognizing continuity and irreversibility of the events in time, and not by seeing oneself as sublime above worldliness. If we understand that irreversibility can be mediated with reversibility, something changes. We can then realize time in a new way, and this other way is quite appropriate for what time is. According to Hegel, it is time whose negativity is again negated by the reflection of special spiritual actions like forgiveness in religion. The negation of time is named eternity. I think this is where Hegel introduces the concept eternity. And therefore, we can say time and eternity are thought together. Metaphorically speaking, it is time that does not run only linearly, but knows circular return. With respect to the logical, so in the remaining time, I want to spell out these theses concerning the mediation and the role of art, religion, and philosophy further. With respect to the logical structure of time, what happens here has to be related back to the concept of negation. Hegel even thinks that the process of negation finds here its continuation. I have just hinted at this. He thinks of a negation of negation, which, however, is carried out in such a way that the moments of negations of the entire previous process are recognized as moments of the current negation. It plays a role in the structure that, according to Hegel, what has developed into a rich concept of time is contradictory. There is, as shown, identity and non-identity between time and the temporal. And in the development of the concept of time, there are tensions and contradictions. Time is uniform and it is not uniform. In the negation of negation, it becomes clear that these contradictions do exist, but that time can also be represented in a way that we understand the contradictory determinations as moments of the development of a comprehensive concept of time. For Hegel, this process of understanding is a business of art, religion, and philosophy. Let us focus on this overall development under the concept of negation. the meaningful time of our life is a negation of the abstract uniformity of time, which we have in physics. In this negation, however, there is also a certain dynamic of concealed self-negation due to the complex identity relationships. Thus Hegel says, quotation, "The other to this negation is outside it. This determination is thus external to it and therefore the contradiction of its being. Meaningful time is negated in the further dynamic itself. This takes place through the passing away of these units of meaningful time. Thus, also meaningful time proves to be a continuum. Hence, time is a continuum of uniform now points, and it is a continuum of non-uniform time units. In both cases, physical time and meaningful time, the continuum is a result of negation. This is where art, religion, and philosophy come into play. There are forms of spiritual self-understanding. They also take place within time and deal with the temporal. At first, one could say, as in meaningful time, here the linear and abstract continuity is negated because processes of self-understanding create differences in the units of time. However, for Hegel, this is not what happens. Rather, something new emerges through these forms, so through art, religion, and philosophy. This has to do, first of all, with the fact that continuity is here once again negated. In art, religion, and philosophy, it is a continuity of abstract and meaningful time that is negated. So this is the negation again. Secondly, and above all, however, what makes these forms of art, religion, and philosophy special has to do with the kind of negation that is characteristic of them. It is a self-referential double negation in contrast to a negation that excludes others. The spiritual activities of art, religion, and philosophy do not negate directly and simply as before on the same level, namely in the case of meaningful time by opposing meaning and uniqueness to uniform now points. In art, religion, and philosophy, we rather negate by making a movement in which continuity of space and time, uniqueness of units of time, and transience of uniqueness are negated, but all of this is also seen as a moment of one movement. Because all of this can be grasped in this process of negation as moments of the negation, time cannot again simply negate these thoughts and this thinking. In sum, one can say that in art, religion, and philosophy, we negate the whole process of temporal realization by imagining, representing, and thinking the specific temporal realization of our time. With the negativity of these activities, we then really overcome the temporal because we accept all different parts as moment of the whole process. Here lies the reason why Hegel speaks of eternity as the negation of time in religion and philosophy without wanting to treat it as something that lies beyond time. As Hegel says, quotation from the Encyclopedia, therefore the finite is transcendent and temporal because it is not, like the concept, in itself total negativity. This total negativity, it's what I want to describe with this movement that has different steps as moments in this movement. This negativity has a positive side that everything one has said about time receives its right and can be seen as a moment of the whole concept. An activity knowing about itself, that is what we can instantiate according to Hegel when we think. How we can do this is systematically represented in logic. We perform an activity of negation in which the generated determinations do not have to be realized if this activity as such is self-transparent. Thus, Hegel says in the paragraph on time of the Encyclopedia, but the concept in its identity with itself, which exists freely for itself, I, is in and of itself absolute negativity and freedom, therefore time not its power. So it does not stand under the power of time. The self-transparency of the activity is prepared in the concept of time from the beginning. Due to the assertion of the identity of time and temporality, negations could always be regarded as self-negations. With regard to the negation of spiritual activity, this means that time is identical with its concept, this now really very complex concept of continuity, meaning, etc., when it carries out a movement of permanent self-negation in which the self-negation is also self-transparent through reflection. These considerations mainly amount to the thesis that the other relationship of time comes about through the fact that we refer spiritually to something in such a way that we recognize its temporality, and can then, because of this acknowledgement, also overcome it. A process of remembering is a reflection on the past, but it also creates something new that is now. This can be grasped, and with this, our relation to time changes. Our relation to time also changes when we understand that forgiveness can erase the act by recognizing it. Love and recognition can take away the fear of death when one understands herself as being in the other. In this way, a meaningful and fulfilled time is possible, which does not have to fear death as an external power. One might doubt this by saying that spiritual activities are also subject to transience. It is right that they themselves take place in time, and maybe also only in special situations. But for Hegel, an understanding of these activities leads to an insight into the structure of time. With this insight, which we get in art, religion, and philosophy, we can really grasp continuity and transience as the internal structure of our life. This gives us the possibility not only to overcome temporality momentarily, but to understand time in such a way that it loses its power over us. So let me say a few words to the end. So I lost my paper. So I just wanted to say again a few things about about my main ideas at the end, namely, let me see. I wanted to concentrate today on the topic of the structure of time. And there are different things that I find of special interest here. I want just to mention some of them for our discussion. It is interesting, I think, to think of time as negation and to claim that there are different concepts of time that stand in a logical relation to each other. It is interesting to think that dimensions of time are mediated with each other, like past and present in remembering. It is also challenging that different things are differently in time, namely like stones and animals, although they are all temporal. And it is challenging to think of art, religion, and philosophy as the ways we reflect and understand temporality. So I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dina, for this wonderful and very, very clear lecture. And as I told at the beginning, we have now 15 minutes for the discussion. And if someone wants to intervene in the discussion, can write something in the chat room, and I can give the word to one wants. Okay. We are waiting for some registrations. I tried to ask something about the final part of your talk, where you have shown how art, religion, and philosophy leads us to an insight into the structure of time, and through this insight, we have the possibility to comprehend the way of being of time, and its being at the same time continuity and transience. And this gives us the possibility to have a sort of overcoming of the time, of temporality. This is for me very clear. But at the end, you remembered the quotation of Hegel, where Hegel says that with this comprehension, we have the possibility to understand time in such a way that it loses its power over us. And this is a little bit problematic for me. Is it really possible to say that time loses its power, or is not perhaps meaningful to say that the understanding of the power that time has over us allows us to live as differently this power, as the power of time over us? I think there is here a sort of similar structure of the relationship between the finite and the infinity in the logic. And the true infinity, it's an overcoming of the finite that is not an elimination of the finite. So my question is, what does it mean concretely that the time in its comprehension loses its power over us?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very good question, and also what you said before about art, religion, and philosophy was a really very good summary of what I wanted to say. Yeah, I agree that there is something problematic with the formulation that it loses the power over us. I would understand it in the sense of it loses the external power over us. So in this case, we really understand power as something which is somehow external, comes about us without that we can understand it. So as if we say that there is the law of time and everything has to just fall under this law, and this is an external law that is essential for all that there is, and things like that. So I wouldn't understand it in the way that there are not anymore these differences, and it is not that we have really to pass away and that things are really like transience. But only in the sense of external power. But you are right that there is only power, and that is somehow problematic. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you, Dina. Brenda in the chat asks if you have a recommendation of further readings on this very meaningful subject about Hegel's concept of time, but you can think about it. And there is a question of Elena Tripaldi. Please, Elena.
Yes, sorry, maybe I should have written my comments. I've seen that other people are writing their questions directly in the comments, so I don't know better. I'll just say it. Actually, I have two questions. One is more of a curiosity, and is what do you think is the best logical structure within the science of logic to describe the structure of time? Because you speak a lot of negation and of double negation, so I was wondering whether you think that we should the doctrine of essence in order to understand the concept of time, and if you think that we look at two different parts of the science of logic in order to understand time and history, if we need to make a distinction. And another question, which is related to the last part of the paper with reference to absolute spirit. You speak of this dimension of eternity, which is still temporal, but is a way of overcoming time or somehow subject. And I'm wondering about the fact that also the disciplines of absolute spirit are in time and they do have a history. And I was wondering whether you think we can, how would you expect the fact that they need to have history, or whether they need to, or they just have history for some reason, they are in time for some external reason, of if this is a function also with reference to this self-understanding that we operate at the level of absolute. So if there is a form of history, thank you. And thanks for the paper, which is really, really rich and interesting.
Thank you very much, Elena. Yeah, so to your first question, that's a good question, but I would say my interpretation of the concept of time really means that the whole logic is the structure of time. There are these remarks of Hegel that the concept is the I and is the time, and I would really understand them so that so it would be that the becoming is the abstract concept of time with which we begin in natural philosophy, and then the whole second part is reflected, so where time is mediated, so in our activities like working, and so that would somehow be in the Wesenslogik, and then the absolute spirit in the subjective logic, in the subjective logic, where this sort of transparency comes into play. So I would say that the whole structure of the logic is the structure of time. This makes time to such an interesting topic, and this is one of the reasons why I think it can maybe help to understand Hegel's logic, because some things are in a way better to understand with the concept of time, like that there is this physical time and there is this experience time. That's something a lot of people think, and this would then really lead to a new understanding of Hegel's logic, because it's dealing somehow with the same structures. And your second part, yeah, I mean, I want to stress that also art, religion and philosophy are really in time and take place in time. I think what makes them special is that while being in time, nevertheless, we can consider or think or understand the whole progress. And that's what makes them at the same time temporal and eternal. But it's not that, again, not that I would say that they're eternal in the sense of beyond time or something which is not in time, but it's really only that there is this sort of self-reflection that leads to eternity. So I would say, I mean, we can discuss about this very long, I think, but I would say that this is the reason why they really need to have history and to realize, have the temporal and things like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dina. Okay, there is a question from, sorry for the pronunciation of the names, but I'm not sure. Othanul Mother, is it possible? She writes, or he writes, I don't know. Sorry, it's noisy here. Okay, the question was about the relation between Hegel and Heidegger and the concept of time in Hegel and Heidegger. If you can say something about differences in the concept of time between Hegel and Heidegger.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other thesis that I mentioned, namely that the physical time is grounded in the concreter concept of time, that this is a thesis that Heidegger then really develops, and this is very important for Heidegger. Whereas I think that this structure of negation and contradiction and all these things, it's not that it is opposed to Heidegger, but it's just not that Heidegger finds this form of metaphysics very fruitful, and he's not so much interested in this logical structure, but that is something which is for Hegel very important. So I would say that they somehow have a similar concept of time, but they have different aspects that are really important for them. And so I think this leads also to other results, namely for Hegel, this absolute spirit, art, religion, philosophy, that's not in the same way in Heidegger, I would say. But this grounding thesis is also in Heidegger, yeah.
Alex, okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Emundts. Thank you for your talk. My question, I guess, in some ways relates to the previous one. I'm wondering about the future in Hegel. So there is this criticism of Hegel that, you know, his system can't really make sense of the future. It's oriented towards the past, and, you know, these notions of end of history and so on. So in truth, he does, you know, I mean, you focused on the notion of forgiveness, right, which is a past-oriented notion.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Hegel himself does that in the Phenomenology, right, in the Spirit chapter. So I'm wondering, though, the conception that you present of the mediation of these temporal dimensions, can that help us make sense of the future in Hegelian terms? And so can we defend him against this criticism? And what might be an example of applying this kind of synthetic mediation to a future-oriented concept or activity?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting question. I mean, I would say that indeed Hegel thinks that the orientation from art, religion, and philosophy is at first hand to the past and somehow bring the past to the present. But I think that the idea is that this makes us somehow again prepared or open and free for the future. And I find this somehow convincing, because I think, for example, with this forgiveness, if somebody is not able to really forgive you in the strict sense that Hegel wants to present, namely that he accepts that you have done it. It's not that he somehow say, no, you haven't done this, it's all okay. No, he really knows you have done it. At the same time, he really thinks that it is somehow undone, that he really forgives you, and that it is not anymore of any relevance for the future. Then I think you can again be really together, like for example in a relationship or wherever. Yeah, so then you are really free to have again the future as something open. You are there again a person without this sort of really mark you had before and things like that. So I think it's a little bit indirect, but I think it's very important to see that all this opens you again for the future, I would say. But I think this question is very interesting, and it's interesting to think to ask if this mediation thing is really also with the future or also for the future. So I think one can really consider this further. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Emily Berninger.
Yes, my wife's signing.
Okay.
I haven't read Hegel in like 10 or 15 years, and so I thought I'd jump in because I'm stumbling across a lot of Marx these days. And in your description of time, I was surprised at how uncontroversial it felt to me.
Okay.
And I'm trying to suss out what is sort of unusual or at odds with like the common conception of time that is worth sort of bringing to the surface. Thank you.
Well, I would say that, I mean, what is, I think that, so that a lot of people would agree is that there are different concepts of time, that we have to somehow consider how they are related to each other, things like that. So, for example, Taylor and this considerations on the structure of time. But I think this idea that we really, in a way, overcome time in art, religion, and philosophy, and the way this is spelled out, this is something which I would say is not so that a lot of people would today just agree with it. And also this idea that this is the real structure of time. It's not only the concept we have, and time is in a way nothing ideal. I mean, it's that this abstract time is in a way it is in a way ideal, but nevertheless what Hegel is spelling out there as a structure is what is really the structure of time. So I would still say that this is something which is not somehow common sense or something like this. But maybe maybe you could say more about why you think it's not uncontroversial. I mean, I would say that there's a lot of really at least challenging the idea of a metaphysic of time, of the logical structure of time, and this idea that this is really a logical structure of negation where the different concepts of time can be integrated in one movement of negation.
I guess not to ask too many questions, but like that time is built on negation seems perfectly self-evident. That you only recognize the passage of time because it is not what it just was, where that's the sensation. And that in absolute stillness, time ceases. Like, and Buddhism has been arguing this for,
okay, I mean, that's what I wanted to say, that I think that Hegel really can capture a lot of somehow common sense or everyday ideas of time. That's actually really something I think is an advantage of his theory of time, and that makes it so good to use time as something which can explain us things in the logic and so. But I think the interpretation, the strong logical interpretation that Hegel gave to these commonsensical moments, this is really like something which is special for Hegel. But I agree with you that there are a lot of things where we would agree. That makes it so fruitful to have this idea of time as something in the center of Hegel's.
I guess what I'm having trouble linking is if we assume the Hegelian concept of time to just be accurate, whatever that means in this context, like, does it change our actions and behaviors and relationships to one another, politically, economically, within a family, with just within
sure.
community?
I would say that, I mean, this is not only his theory of time. I mean, I would say that his theory of how we relate to each other, that we have to accept the other as being at the same time the same, but at the other time really different from us. All this is really that it changed our life and our relationships to one another. And also I think that, for example, the theory of time is so that, for example, the fear of death will vanish, and that we will, for example, see the other people as somehow that which is important for our eternity, things like that. So yes, I would say it changes a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you very much. There is a question from Michalis Tegos. Is it right?
Yes, hello. Greetings to everybody. Thank you, Professor Emundts, for this very interesting paper. I myself am working on the concept of the moment in Hegel, which I find links very much to the whole discussion. My question is the following. If I understood well, you would agree with this point of view that, as a previous speaker mentioned, the logic is far from being, time is far from being absent from the logic in this point of view. In a sense, from this point of view, the logic is about time because it explains the logical structure of negation. And from this point of view, I think it also makes perfect sense that the phenomenology in which, in the final chapters, time is identified with the concept becomes a prerequisite, a presupposition for the logic itself. This is how he thought about it. And I think that the concept of moment is something like the concept of Geist, precisely because it shows this duality and this tension between the temporal and the eternal, as you would perhaps say, yes. But my question is the following. I think that in talking about religion, his argument is a little bit more sharp, because if I recall, and please correct me if I am wrong, the first systematic use of this concept of moment is in Faith and Knowledge. It is with regards precisely to the death of God. It is this moment that opens, in a sense, this perspective for philosophy. The death of God opens this perspective of time being equated with the concept and thus with eternity, no? Thank you very much once again. So my question is whether this is precisely the opposite which is taking part. It is an obliteration of eternity within time.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you very much. Concerning the phenomenology, I really think that it is very interesting to read the phenomenology under this perspective. What idea of time is there? Because I think, though it's not that Hegel spells this out, it has a lot to do with time. Like from the beginning, it is that we experience something as lasting, for example. So there are a lot of really time-related topics also there. I think that's very interesting. And yeah, it is this structure, I would agree with what you said, that is then the topic of the logic. Yeah, I think the first point I just would agree. Concerning the second point, yeah, this is interesting. I mean, my reading of Hegel, but this has not to do especially with the topic of time. My reading of Hegel's idea of religion is more that he really somehow, I mean, you can read this relation between religion and philosophy in different ways. And I wouldn't say that this is only my way to read it is the right one. Yeah, I think that this is a complicated topic. I read it with respect to time, really, so that all that religion has as interpretation is an interpretation of the mediations of time, but it is an interpretation that is not yet really the interpretation of the thinking or of philosophy. So for example, the whole idea of God and Christ and the relation of them, these are all somehow pictures, and not like in art, but still something like a metaphorical idea of the mediation of time dimensions. So for example, the Christ is the presence as somebody who has the eternity and the finite, both in it. But philosophy is able to think the whole relationship. So to really grasp what sort of mediation is there in these activities like forgiveness. So I would, but as I said, I think you also can really read it the other way around, namely that Hegel is much more religious than in my interpretation. In my interpretation, these are really ways to understand what time and mediation really is.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a registration from Giovanna Mioli.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Emundts, for your talk, which was really illuminating. I have two questions, actually. The first one is, it seems to me that the character of time, according to which it admits differences in time units and therefore is non-uniform and can be described as meaningful time, is not so much a structural character of time as an operation activated by subjectivity in order to free itself from the power of time. But on your account, however, it seems that we should understand such a character as structuring time itself. So I will ask if you could clarify a little bit more this point, why it is so. And the second question would be, if you could expand upon the role of memory, which you mentioned in your talk, in relation to this subjectivity's act of liberation from the power of time.
Okay, thank you. It's quite complicated questions, I think. Okay, concerning the first question, I mean, I tried to give you an answer, but maybe it's not sufficient, and then you can please ask again. I would say that Hegel sees at first concept the abstract concept, which is a physical time. I mean, also there are degrees and development. I leave this aside now, but of course it's for him also a different, like a stone or a chemical process is in time. These are also degrees of richness, but I leave this aside. Okay, then you have this physical time and then this meaningful time. And I would say that they really stand in a contradictory relationship to each other. So that the meaningful time says things like, look, it's not that we have only now points and that all is all the time the same, and also and only like a sequence where one similar moment follow the other, but it's that one moment is important, one moment lasts, the other is like only a moment in time. So this is the difference from the meaningful time to the with respect to the or in comparison with the abstract time. And these two stand in contradiction to each other, but to think about these two concepts of time leads to understanding them as both moments of one structure, namely where both are again negated, and where this process of negation is that which lasts. And so I would say that this meaningful time is a moment in the structure where this somehow, I would say this comes, but this is now very complicated. I would say that this comes from that there is this non-identity claim with respect to time and the temporal is somehow able to really stand in contradiction to the uniformity. Nevertheless, in the end, the uniformity is that then is the again in negating this meaningful time. So I would say that this is all part of this structure of negation. And I'm not sure where, where exactly you would now not agree with in this, because what you said was not, for me, not clear why this is then for you not the case.
Okay, I was just thinking that probably it's part of the concept of time, this possibility to give meaning, different meanings to past, present, future. And it's something which the subject can do. Not the stones, not other.
Yeah, no, I would agree there. I mean, that's something only a subject can do, but nevertheless, this is a dimension of time that then leads to a more and richer and concreter concept of time. And this is, I mean, in a way, that's the reason why it is the same structure, because for Hegel, this object, subject are somehow both in the same development. That's the reason why this is again this Hegel's idea that which we as subject are able to is somehow something which fulfills what was there already before. I would say this is with time exactly the same. And it's interesting, I think this can be spelled out much further than I did in this talk, but I think that this idea in the physical time, that time is really one after the other, and that this is not reversible, that this is something we also need in physics, but that we really cannot just say that the second moment is really not before but after the other, is something which only is justified through the subjective perspective and to our experience time. And this is the reason why the physical time is somehow grounded in the experience time. So the objective is somehow grounded in the subjective, but in a special way. But as I said, I would agree with you that this is something which is only possible because we have feelings and all these things, and are in that way subjective. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and with respect to the memory, this was again a very complicated question. I mean, my idea was that Hegel has always this mediation of time dimensions, like in memory, for example, we have the past, but it's, if we remember something, it's never only the past, but it's also that we do this now, we create it, we have a relation to it, things like that. And this is where, this is in a way the story how these dimensions are mediated. But the important is that we can really recognize this also. And this is what we do in art, religion, and philosophy. And by this recognition, a new dimension comes into play. So I would say that memory is the mediation, something where we can see that, or where time really is in this mediation part, but this to get free and to really liberate oneself from time has to do with that we cognize these structures. Yeah, and this is something I find very important. It's not just that in forgiving somebody, we are free from the power of time or something. Yeah, it's only by recognizing that this is how things are, that we then are free.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have two questions too, and the first one is from Cassandra Teodosio.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
I would just like to ask how similar or different Hegel's concept of time is from Immanuel Kant's.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Good. I mean, I think that you can, again there, I would say that you can see the Kant and Hegel as being very opposite to each other, but I wouldn't. I think that in a way, Hegel really wants to spell out the Kantian idea of time, namely for Kant, time would be, Kant would be this abstract time, this physical time. And Hegel wants to then ground this concept of time in this experience time, and then in this idea of cognizing time in art, religion, and philosophy. So I would say that that there are some theses about time that they really share, and Hegel wants to develop this theory in a way that then is, for him at least, so that we can now see why physical time is the way Kant thinks it is. But maybe you can ask more about it if this is not a good answer for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, if you want to say something. Okay. Luca Corti, please. Luca.
All right. First of all, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I would like to ask something about your notion of meaningful time and how you define that, and also in relation to a meaningless time. I assume that there must be some meaningless time. Something that strikes me is that you define this notion of meaningful time in a dichotomic way, so opposing it to a meaningless time, and you use only example from what Hegel would call the spiritual realm, so art, religion, and philosophy. And it seems to me that something is left out if you use only spiritual example, because it seems Hegel has a quite specific understanding of another important, meaningful aspect of time, which is biological time, which is not completely spiritual. Sorry, it's not completely spiritual time, and it's not completely meaningless time. And to the extent that the animal, as a biological being, as a organic unity, is capable of establishing a particular relation to time, which is not spiritual, but it's not meaningless time either. So I would like to ask you what you think about this. It's to the further dimension. Where should we add this dimension in this dichotomy between meaningful and meaningless time?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very important and interesting point. Thank you. As I said before, I think when I answered Giovanna's question, I think that there are really degrees in all stages. So it's not that there is only physical time, then there is meaningful time, and this is then in the spiritual world. But I think that also in the physical world, there are degrees, and of course, even more in the biological, so animals or plants and animals, there are always different degrees of this concreter concept of time. And I used not only art, so like forgiveness, this is maybe something, at least in Hegel's sense, that is in religion, but I also had the example of enjoying and working and and also maybe perceiving. I had this where time is somehow mediated. My point is that you need art and religion and philosophy to cognize these things. But it's not that meaningful time also comes with this cognizing. Meaningful time is before, but you can get a lot from this understanding of meaningful time, and this makes you really to be somehow free of time or to internal. So the internal is only there for the spiritual beings, but nevertheless meaningful time is there before that. So without cognizing or grasping things, there is meaningful time. So I would agree with you. And for animals, of course, there is also something like meaningful time, even more for human beings, without that they have things like art and religion and philosophy. Like in working, for example, this is really can be a meaningful time without that you think about it. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, great.
Marianne, are you here? No, she's not here. Okay, we have sorry. Okay. The Professor Menegoni told us to give you warm greetings. She
thank you.
could not be here, but really she wanted to give
thank you very much.
some greetings. Okay, I think we don't have other questions, and Dina works a lot, have worked a lot with this discussion. Dina, really, thank you very much for your kindness, for your willingness. And
thank you. It was really
we
very
wait
good
for you in Padova.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much. It was very helpful for me. I will work on this again, and then it was very helpful. Thanks for all your questions and for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.